This week it's Julia, and I am talking to Dr. Sophie King-Hill, who has worked for many years in the world of sex education and working with young people. Welcome, Sophie.
Oh, hiya, thanks for having me.
You're really welcome. I'd love to start by hearing a little bit more about how you started to do this work, how you found yourself in rooms with young people talking about taboo subjects that people don't want to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm 45 now, so it started when I was in my early 20s, so a while ago now, and I'd always had a passion for youth justice, and having fairness around children and young people and listening to their voices. So I was working for an establishment that educated young ex-offenders, so mainly lads, mainly boys. And, I thought they were really inspirational, that they had some really sad stories. I think when people look from the outside, they don't account for the sadness. They just think, oh, these kids are bad, but actually not. A lot of them have got a really sad story that has caused them to end up where they are. So I was already kind of thinking about youth. And then I had my first child at 26. I've got 4 now. And that really made me start thinking about teenage parents, what's being done for them. So with a local training provider, I set up a programme across Birmingham and Solihull that worked with young parents. And that was at the time of the Labour government's teenage pregnancy strategy. So there was a lot of ring fence funding at that time. And I did that job for about 6 years. And, they were some of the most inspirational young people I think I've ever met. They love their children as much as I love mine. They got a bit more energy than me. But society gave them such a raw deal, and I couldn't work it out. It took me years, and I was thinking, why doesn't society like these young people? Why are they so demonized? Because working with them, they were amazing. And I quickly came to the realization that it was society's perceptions around sex and sexuality, and and that mutual exclusivity around sex and young people. And of course, there's no more of an advert that you've had sex than a big pregnant belly or a pushchair. And then if you're a young person with that, there's an added stigma. Even across young people, there's a stigma. And so I realised that, the way to work in this field and to give young people back their choices around what they do within their lives is to work within sexual health and sexual behaviours. And there was a real poignant moment in my career when working with a group of young parents, and I'd known them quite a while, so 3 months or so, working with them a couple of times a week. So there's a real trust there. And then one of them said, just before we start the session, can you just tell me how I got pregnant? And the next one said it, and the next one said it. All of them, not one of those young women who were aged between 14 and 16 and either pregnant or had got a baby, knew the mechanism of how they got pregnant. They knew it was through sex, but they didn't know about ovulation. They didn't know about the menstrual cycle. They didn't know about the contraception that was available to them or where they could get it. And that's because they'd dropped out of school before these key educational points, which for me, I think, looking at my research now, it's too late. We do this too late. And they were wonderful parents, but their choice had been taken away. And that was the big pivot point. I think we've all got these pivot points in our careers, haven't we, or in our lives where it's a game changer. And then from there, I was really lucky to go and work in sexual health with a young person, sexual health charity, educating on sex and relationships in schools from when they start school upwards right up to 18. And that was great. I loved it. And over doing that, I never encountered any young people that didn't want to talk about this, that didn't want to talk about these aspects that impact on them. They didn't shy away from it. They wanted the information. And then after that, I became their national impact coordinator at this charity. So I was looking at the research. And at that same time, I was doing a PhD because I started studying when I was 26, when I had my first child. And then, so my research was around sexual behaviours in children and young people. And then I moved into academia, and that's where I've built the kind of research portfolio that I've got now. I mean, there was a reluctance of going into academia because I was really worried I wouldn't work with young people anymore and that I would lose touch and I would lose sight of what what was really driving me. But I still find myself sitting in a room full of young people, full of vigor, full of optimism, listening to them and seeing what drives them. And that's through the kind of participatory approaches that I use with research when working with children and young people. So that's the last 20 years of my life.
That's amazing. And in what you've said, I can hear that there's a lot of circle work that's occurred over the years. And you've talked about a variety, all young people, a variety of circumstances. So what I'm interested to hear is how those various circles worked. And the first one that I'd like to talk to, because you mentioned it first, is the young parents. So there might be people thinking, I'd love to work with people who've got young children as a group. How does that work, bringing people into a room to hear their voices? They've got babies with them, and when their schedules could be all over the place and their lives could be completely turned upside down. So how can you bring those people into a space together?
I think first of all, you've got to recognise that the stigma that surrounds them, so they're already guarded. Just because not one person has probably congratulated them on the pregnancy like they did with me when I was having my children, or not one person has said, oh, you got a baby, how exciting. Not one person accounts for how much they love those children, and that, so the defences are up, which they would be for anybody. So it's about that, first of all, when they're through the door, well, saying, congratulations, once they've decided to keep the baby, why not look forward to it? But also, acknowledging those stigmas in society and helping them recognise that they all have a common ground in this. So it's about setting up the safe space, and that's a thread that runs through all of my work with young people. Is it's got to be a safe space, and sometimes that can take a couple of sessions just to very gently talk about ground rules, but you don't make it as formal as that and what's expected. But if you've got young people and little children and babies in the room, it can't be a formal space. You've just got to kind of roll with it. There might be a baby crying, there might be someone who's tired, so it's kind of being led by the group, but also recognizing how important that safe space is for them, even in the really informal conversations that they might be having. That when they asked me how they got pregnant, that really demonstrated that they'd never had that space, ever, to ask how they got pregnant, and this is a huge game changer, isn't it, when you have kids? And they never felt safe enough, and they felt safe enough in a room to do that. But that took 3 months before, and that wasn't prompted by me either. That was, they finally felt confident enough to ask these questions without feeling stupid, without feeling ridiculed, without being told that they knew nothing because they were children. So I think but you've got to be really laid back when working with young people as well. I see that, I mean, I'm jumping a little bit, but in the work that I do with the young men and boys, again, it's a very different setup. But I think when you talk about the circle and the kind of safeness and the being together, I think it is the same. It's got the same kind of value base.
And what does that look like, creative? Because you said, it can take time. So if you kind of take us through maybe from the first time people come together to the next, maybe the gaps between the kind of communication that you might have with them between the times that you meet, how does that trust build up? And is it just you there, or how many people, or what are the different roles of the people who aren't the young people who are there?
So if we're talking about young parents, I think you've got to know your group before you have your group. So it's good to see them one-on-one first and have a chat with them about, their histories and things like that. And so you're kind of building that bond already. And I think you've got to be really sensitive to anything that might be upsetting for them. But I think in terms of the bond, it is about, you've got to approach this that they are equal to us. You're not in a position of power. The minute you think that, or you think you're in charge, or they're not equal, then it'll never work. They're the experts in the world that they live in today. Yeah, you might be the facilitator, but they're no less valuable than you. And I think you have to come to any group of young people like that. And I think if you genuinely believe that, I think the rest unfolds naturally, because they sense that. We all sense that, don't we? You know, if somebody thinks they're better than us or thinks they're in charge, or if there's a power dynamic. But if you come to the group and say, look, I'm the facilitator, but you know, we are all equal in this, and our voices are equally as valid. And I'm here to learn as well. I think it naturally evolves how it should, but you've got to mean it. You know, it can't be tokenistic. You can't just go in and say it and not believe it, because people will pick up on that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you demonstrate that. That's a hard thing to, I know that's a hard question to ask.
I think just being generally interested in people and listening and being prepared to change how you think about something, being prepared to see that you might be wrong and say that, oh, you've proved me wrong here. Thanks for the information. Ask them how they want the group set up. Let it be a joint decision. You know, should we have the table? Should we not? What do you reckon? What should we put where? Especially with the under 16s, they're used to asking for things like going to the toilet and eating. Well, I would never do that in a group. I'd be like, look, if you need the toilet, that's your business. So just go to the toilet. Or if you need to eat, that's fine. Especially with young parents, you know, they're eating, that was crucial. And I think that's something that can, you know, if you're working in schools as well, you know, you can set up that space and say, look, if you need to go to the toilet, go to the toilet. And when I've done work with with other groups of young people, they think it's great at first, and we'll go to the toilet like every 10 minutes. But then after a while that wanes, and they just go, because they realise it's not a thing, and we are equal and it's fine, just go to the toilet when you need it, or eat when you need to. Let's move the chairs around, move around if you need to. And I think it's about, but meaning that and not feeling irritated, because quite often as well with young people, they'll fiddle about. I mean, I think I do it when I can't sit still and listen for a long period of time. You know, if they're up and then they're sitting on the table and fiddling about, looking out the window, they're still listening and they'll still join in. But that's the way that they listen. As well, I'd always, when I've been running sessions, teaching sessions as well, if they need a headphone in to listen to music, that's fine. And I would say that, you know, do what you need to do. There's no problem here. You know, all I ask is that we're all really respectful of each other and that we're all equally valuable within the session. So in terms of that practicality, it is about those small things that really value people as individuals.
And you've been talking about the school setup. Sex education in school is so important, and the idea of it being delivered in circle rather than with somebody standing in front of children sitting at desks seems essential to me.
Oh yeah,
as a circle holder. I'd love to hear how that works. I'd love to hear how you work with the young people, but also your communication with the teachers as well, because they're responsible for the delivery of this education. So it would be really great to hear how that's worked.
I think it's really complex when it's in a school, and it's always driven by the school leadership team and how they feel about relationships and sex education. I've seen some really good sessions, some amazing sessions that are run by teachers that have that kind of circle set up, you know, that everyone's equal here, and it's about information sharing and thinking about how they can keep themselves safe, and also for the educator, facilitator, learning about young people's worlds, because it's so vastly different. You know, to me at 45, it's a completely different world that children and young people living today around sex and sexuality and sex education. So it's even more crucial. But I've also seen it done really badly. And I carried out a piece of research with a group of young people aged 14 and 15. So I got some funding, and my idea was to make a resource for relationships and sex education. So I took the curriculum into them, and I said, right, pick a topic, let's design something. We've got this bunch of money. I'll show you the research process, it's participatory, and they'll see it step by step. And then we had the money to create the resource. Well, they sat there for a while and they very politely said that my idea wasn't very good. And they were so polite about it. But they were like, look, you can be a good educator with a pen and a piece of paper in this field. But what you've got to do is listen to young people. And they came up with all of these different things that leadership teams need to do, educators, facilitators need to do. And then one of them said, why don't we just make a guide for teachers and leadership teams on how to teach it? And that's what we ended up doing. And we've got a booklet called A Student's Guide to What You Don't Know, which was completely designed by them and a local graffiti artist. Every word in there is theirs. I just turned up with the cash from, the reason for the research. And that was a really important lesson to me that, participatory research or any work with young people, you've got to be prepared to change your mind. I've done it for 20 years and now I do now know that I know nothing, but I do know I've got a platform and I know that we have to be led by young people. We can help scaffold them, but we have to involve them in these conversations. But that was a really clear example of where young people took over and led really effectively, and we produced a resource. It's free, it's freely available. Just it gives ideas for leadership teams and teachers in how to approach this with young people. But also I think we put a lot on schools, and some people just aren't comfortable teaching it. And if somebody's not comfortable talking about it because of the social stigmas around relationships and sex anyway, in over 18s, then we don't give that kind of allowance to teachers to say to their leadership team, I'm quite uncomfortable teaching this, or even the leadership team being proactive and saying, are you comfortable teaching this? And if not, we can do a swap around, because there's nothing worse than someone awkward teaching a group of year 9s, year 10s about sex or different aspects of sex.
They can smell fear.
Hey?
They can smell fear.
Oh
they
yeah,
can smell,
they can, but it
tell.
embarrasses everyone and it reinforces shame as well. But it's just not a very nice experience for anyone. So I think there's that acknowledgement without any blame that some people could just don't want to teach it. I think it's useful and important to explore their reasoning behind it. So to make sure that that's explored effectively within supervisions with them, that it's not about kind of certain ideologies that are driving them. And if it is, that's worth unpicking with them. But if it is just sheer embarrassment, then that needs to be acknowledged as well. So it has to be the right person to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for there to be shame and fear around talking about these subjects with young people, because if the teacher never spoke about it at that age, if stigma was attached to their lives around menstruality or sex or any of those things, then if they haven't had the opportunity to unpack that for themselves, it puts them in a very vulnerable position to have to educate.
It really does. I think there's quite a lot of naivety when we hear policies being bandied around and what needs to happen, what doesn't need to happen. I think the naivety comes from forgetting there's an internet. And I think the internet's a real double-edged sword. We can't just ban pornography. They're going to access it, whether it's intentional or unintentional. They're going to see it probably by the time that they're 18. Everybody Googles everything. Everybody searches things up on TikTok, and there's some really good accounts out there on TikTok, but there's also some really bad ones. And I think we've got to recognise that if we aren't supporting young people with information that they might need, or helping them with the critical reflection on the information that they're seeing, rather than instructing them, I think we're doing them a great disservice. I think they go in to search things on the internet, but they need that space, so the circle, however it looks, to come to and say, well, I searched this on TikTok without shame, saying something without shame. I searched this on TikTok and it said this, or I searched this on Twitter, or I saw this pornography, somebody sent it to me and I need to make sense of it. Or I looked on Pornhub and I clicked on this certain category. I didn't know what it meant and I don't understand. We've got to get to that point, where they can bring these things that they've seen or they've heard or they've read to a safe space to unpick it critically together without shame or judgment. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. So do you work with adults as well, or have you worked with adults as well as young people? So have you found yourself in a room with teachers, working through with them how they can then go into the classroom and sit in circle with their students around sex education?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I've worked with training professionals and talking to them about how we approach relationships and sex education and all the different things that need consideration. And I think once you start unpicking it, people are on board, and they understand there's a lot of fear around relationships and sex education. It's quite, well, within the last 14 years of the previous government, it was weaponised, which reinforced the shame that people were feeling, which also made schools very cautious because of the backlash that we were seeing in the news in some schools. So schools were, like I said, they were cautious, but you could see the reason why they were cautious about talking about it, about teaching about it. But I think once you sit down with a group of professionals and also parents and unpick, the reasons why we need to do that, give them all the research that's out there that tells us that, that there's lots of different research from lots of different fields that tells us that young people are more likely to delay sexual activity the more information they have. So it doesn't sexualize a child. What it does is protect a child. There's a lot of research about reducing child sexual abuse through really good relationships and sex education from an early age, so they can recognise when things are happening to them that shouldn't be, that they have a safe space to report. And I think once you sit down with professionals and you talk about these kind of the fears and the shame and the embarrassment around sex, but then you say, well, this is the reason we're doing it. We're doing it to protect children and young people. We're doing it to arm them with the tools, the critical tools that they'll need to make these decisions around their lives, rather than thinking about having sex at a party at midnight after a bottle of vodka on a pile of coats. They'll have thought this through first. They'll have had that chance to think, well, I actually don't want to do that. So if I find myself in that situation, I won't make a kind of sudden decision. Same around contraception, condom use, anything around this that we can talk about first helps them think about their decision-making processes around it, rather than that kind of last-minute impulsive decision. That they'll have had that opportunity. And I think when you work with professionals and you set that out and you talk about the evidence base behind it. So as an academic, everything I do is driven by evidence. And there's this wealth of evidence that supports early relationships and sex education, that keeps children and young people safe on so many different levels, including being emotionally and psychologically safe.
Yeah. So the nerves that teachers might have is that for them, a safe space can be standing at the front of the classroom with that control. You can't go to the bathroom, you can't eat, you can't fidget, you can't listen to music, all those things in place that keep them separate and prevent the young people from feeling comfortable enough and safe enough to share. So what have you done, or what can you do, or what can they do to feel safe? Because as a facilitator, you have to feel safe in order to enable those conversations. So how do you turn a teacher who's used to standing in front of the classroom into a teacher who is happy to sit on a level with the children while needing to maintain that level of authority that a teacher needs in order to prevent mayhem from occurring?
I think it would be better in smaller groups, and to acknowledge it and to say, I'm not used to teaching this way. It's very different for me. Let's see how it works out. Transparency is key with things like this, because people can see through, when you're saying, oh, we're doing this because of this. But that's not the reason. It's giving those kind of, just being honest, being a human being with them. And people accept that, because you can only be who you are, and you can say, I'm not used to teaching like this. However, all the evidence tells us this is a really good way. Young people tell us this is a good way. What do you think? Is this the best way for this group? And there might be some topics that they're like, yes, just stand at the front and teach us it. And there might be other topics where they're like, no, we really want to talk about it. We really need to discuss this. But I don't think there's anything wrong with showing vulnerability. Even as a teacher, it doesn't mean that you're showing weakness. That's quite often those two words are seen as a lot of conflated together, aren't they? But that's not the case. Showing vulnerability is a strength. And I've found that talking about really controversial things with groups of young people that have been excluded from a lot of different schools, saying, well, I don't really understand this. Can you tell me how it is? Or what do you think about sitting in this setup? How does it work for you? I've never done it before. You know, showing vulnerability in that way helps, I think, strengthen the group.
Yeah. Within the state system, there is a numbers game as far as adult to child ratios are concerned that can be really problematic because there aren't enough teachers for the number of children. So are there ways to overcome that? Because if there, if what we need is smaller groups, are there ways to facilitate those smaller groups happening?
Yeah, I think you can, and I think again it's transparency with the young people to say ideally we should do this in smaller groups, but we can't. So and then you can give each group different tasks to work on, so you can split them into smaller groups if you're only one teacher. Give them all a task, a discussion task to feedback to the rest of the group. But then it depends on the cohort that you've got. You know, some of the young people I've worked with, that wouldn't work for them. You know, and it has to be smaller groups. And then other young people, you know, that would be really effective, a really effective way to work together. But it's a tricky one. Like I said, you know, we put a lot on the shoulders of schools and of teachers. And they're faced with these issues a lot. But, you know, this is such a fundamentally important topic that drives everything, that it has to be given the logistical setup that it needs. But it's the school has got to start seeing it as not a bolt-on, as not an add-on. You know, if they've got good PHSE, if they've got good relationships and sex education, it drives everything. They can't sit in a maths lesson if they're stressing because they've had unprotected sex the night before, or they're stressing because they've seen some violent pornography, or they're stressing because somebody's told them something about sex that they didn't know before. You know, they can't sit there and do algebra. They just can't, you know, but it's not given in a lot of schools. And this is a top-down issue, really. It's not given the value that it should, in terms of how it shapes people, how it translates to other subjects. And it doesn't have to be just a bolt-on, you know, it can go through all the topics, can't it? You know, for example, history is a really good one. You know, that's really good for LGBTQ plus education. You know, LGBTQ plus shouldn't just sit within sex and relationships. It can go through history, English literature. You know, so there's a whole school approach to be had here. You know, even if they can't split off into small groups, the message can be there. You know, running through as a thread.
Wouldn't it be amazing if there was a whole school approach, if every single curriculum subject had sex education woven through it? I think that's true of so many issues that face humans, that if it could be taken from that perspective of we're humans and biology is a topic, we're humans, history is a topic, we're humans, music's a topic, it can, you know, it can work. And then the teachers could potentially be more comfortable as well with the way that they're educating the students.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because you've got this toolkit that was created by the young people, is there any kind of toolkit to go alongside that, or that's part of that actually says the how? Because there's the educational content and then there's the delivery.
Yeah, the toolkits, the young people are telling the schools how to do it. They've said, you know, give us anonymous questionnaires, ask us what we want to know. Let us evaluate with you, let us lead the sessions. That came out really strongly, that they want to help lead the sessions. They also said that schools are consistently telling them things they already know. You know, that they're being taught things, either things are being repeated or things that they already have known for years because of the internet. And I think, you know, this approach that they said, look, even if the students aren't comfortable telling you what they already know, they will anonymously. So you can have an anonymous question box. That's one I used to do when I used to work at the sexual health charity. Or you can get anonymous feedback. What do you want to learn in relationships and sex education? What do you know already? What has confused you? What has upset you? What has stressed you out? What burning questions have you got? And then that's a way to be steered by the young people without putting them on the spot as well, is to create that kind of anonymity around it in terms of their feedback. And that was something that came out, like how to do it.
Yeah, that's something that we use very regularly in circles. Like if there's a topic that's difficult, get everyone to write things down, pop those things in the middle, squidge them up, and then let somebody else pick it out and ask questions, so that they're not speaking from their own voice, they're speaking from a voice that's in the room, but not from there. And the leadership skills that you've discussed, that's a skill set that's amazing for young people to have. So if sex education could be a vehicle for teaching young people mentoring and leadership skills, that's a skill set actually every school would want their young people to have.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there is still a bit of a fear with some schools in doing that. In terms of the anonymous questions, when I used to do it, I'd give them all the same pen, all the same post-it. And if they didn't have a question or a comment, they'd have to write, I don't have a comment or question. So everyone is writing on, and no, you can't tell from the piece of paper that you pick up who said what. And I'd read out every question, but then if you do that on a number of occasions, you start to see patterns and themes. And so you'll know the things to pick up on within the classroom with young people. So you'll be able to see how the school's thinking, or maybe they've accessed, or some sort of pornography is being shared at that time. There's ways to pick up through that issues within the school. And within the class that need picking up quite quickly. And I think, we've got to be really careful of strict parameters around this as well. For example, if pornography is being shared in a year 6 group, so that's age 11, 12, you have to do a session on pornography. We can't shy away from it. We don't want them to Google it. We want them, well, they will Google it and they'll search it on TikTok, but also we want them to be able to have that safe space to unpick it. But I think we've got to stay away from strict parameters around that. We have to be led by what's going on, and and it's also contextual. So the type of education you'll need in an inner city school, I don't know, like Tower Hamlets, for example, is very different to what you would need in a school in Newquay in Cornwall. There'll be certain things that everybody needs to know, but that you still have to take the steer from the context that the young people are in as well.
And are parents engaged in the process as well?
It's really difficult to engage parents within this. I think parents like to trust schools to do this. When you do get parents in, or if parents, so for example, if parents say they don't want their child having relationships in sex ed, it's really useful to get them in and to be really gentle with them, because they only want the best. Generally, they only want the best for their children, same as everybody. So nobody's there at the detriment of the child. And I think you have to start on that page just to think they want the best for their child. And you have to be really gentle and sit down and show them all the research and how it protects children. And people then generally come on board with that and realise, that the education is there to support children in making informed decisions around their lives in a very sexually charged society, given you've got to look at advertising, look at the internet, look at the wide use of pornography. It's everywhere. So if you do get those parents in, once you show them the research, but you have to do it without judgment. You don't sort of, we know best. It's like, well, we understand you want the best for your child. Here's the research, and this is why we're doing it. It's tricky to get parents in to do, like workshops, but there's a real lack of research and support for parents anyway. There's loads, when you have a baby in this country, you get loads of information, don't you, about physical development of children and young people, don't you, and the psychological development. But we don't get anything about the sexual development and what's to be expected when, and how to have conversations. And so parents don't really get much, but there isn't a lot of research out there on parents either. And there's no parents' voices in this in a research capacity, to say this is what parents say they want. There's not a great deal of that out there, and I think that's a bit of a missing piece of the puzzle, because parents and carers, they can be the key to supporting the schools and the education, and also the young person. And again, it's okay for parents not to feel comfortable talking to their children and young person about it, but as long as they're getting it from a safe space somewhere, so for instance at school.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear around parents because of their own lack of knowledge of the technology that the young people are accessing and how they're accessing it. The idea that as an adult, less than your child is quite a scary thing, and especially when it's around sexual health, which is difficult to talk about anyway. So maybe that's a piece of research that definitely needs to be done. I know that you've worked with vulnerable boys as well, and that is such important work to do, because they can be demonized with regard to sexual health and the idea of sex education. I'd love to know a little bit more about how you work with those boys.
Well, first of all, I think we've got to lead with the premise that nobody listens really to boys very much, young men and boys, especially those that are not within the education system and have been excluded, for example. That's not instead of talking to young women and girls, that's and other genders and non-binary folk. This is all equally as important. It's not an or, it's an and. And at the moment, we know there's an issue with violence against women and children. Women are overwhelmingly beaten, raped, and murdered by men. Okay, we know that issue. We know that's there. But I think what we need to do is take the blame out of it. We know what's going on because at the moment, the approaches that we're taking are not working. It's getting worse. Okay, the evidence is telling us. So there's some pretty robust evidence from lots of different fields that's telling us that this problem is not going away anytime soon. And one of the ways to tackle this is to get boys on board. So in the research that I've done, the groups that I've worked with boys, we ask them these questions. We say, well, this is happening. Why is it happening? How do we stop it? And, I had a young man say to me, he's only 15, he said, we're always told we're part of the problem, but we're never allowed to be part of the solution. And that really struck a chord with me, is that, where are these safe spaces for young men and boys to say how they're truly feeling, because they're constantly told that they're a problem, they're privileged, but actually there's a complexity around young men and boys, the same as everybody. They might come from a really disadvantaged background, they might have lived in poverty, they might come from a violent household. Nobody accounts for that because there seems to be this broad brush rhetoric within society that boys are bad. Nobody talks as well about consent and boys. When we talk about consent, it's always telling a boy no, isn't it? It's what if a boy doesn't want to consent? There's no public discourse around that at the moment. And that's a conversation we need to shift pretty rapidly, because from the conversations that I've had with young men and boys, they don't feel like they can say no, even if they don't want to, because they're very aware of the rejection the other person would feel, and that they're very aware of where that sits within the hierarchy of masculinity. But there is no avenue for them to even think about saying no. So that's something that they have to negotiate themselves. And it's about acknowledging them as valuable human beings, valuable individuals within a space. And I've worked with various boys from different schools. So one school, a lot of the boys have been excluded from school. So and again, you just leave them. A lot of them have to move a lot. That's fine, because they're still listening and they still contribute. And their voice is still valuable. And I think we forget that, especially with the ones that have been kicked out of school. These lads, they're still human. So the way to kind of start looking at this problem differently is to talk to young men and boys and to actually listen to what they're saying, and then try to get them to work with across genders, to try to figure these issues out. And I think they, from my experience, it's definitely doable with young people. Maybe people my age, we're a bit too set in our ways now to even look at things completely differently. But for young people, there's hope. There's hope, but we've got to start listening to them. And I think boys, we really don't listen because we're constantly told that they're bad. There's this implication, isn't there? You need to do more. You need to, and really, actually, we've got to think there's an intersectionality with male mental health, isn't there? There's a huge male mental health problem at the moment, and then these are not separate issues. We're not listening to young men and boys. They're not able to talk. There's no safe spaces for them. So it's no surprise that the mental health of young men and boys is plummeting. But these things are intersections. However, it's not all negative. It's one of the spaces where I've seen the most movement in the last 5 years. So in the relationships and sex ed space, sometimes you can go 2 steps forwards and 3 back, and it can feel really frustrating and really upsetting. With the boys space, I think people have suddenly started to realise what we're doing isn't working. We have to do more because things are getting worse, not better. And I think one of the reasons for this is because there's been some really toxic influences that have risen over the last few years that have made people stop and think, what have we done? What have we done if these people can get traction with our young men and boys? So I think, the mindset around boys and young men is changing for the better. And there's a lot of really good work going on in this space at the moment, because people are starting to change the way that they think about working with young men and boys and actually listening to them. In some of the research that I've done, we found that there was a conflict between the external and internal self. So the internal self, was who they are as a person. Do they like gardening? Are they silly? Do they like certain TV programs? Are they interested in spy programs? That who they are. Are they quite quiet? Are they quite loud and outgoing? That's who they are as a person. And what we found was that conflicts very starkly with the external self that they have to show, being a boy and a young man, that they have to portray a certain way of being a man or a boy within this kind of hierarchy of masculinity. And this isn't something you can close the front door on now. This exists on the online and offline worlds. So, for me, the online world is very separate to my offline world, which I see as my real life. Whereas for children and young people now, the online and offline worlds are seamless. And so for young men and boys, that having to show a different person to who they are externally, that was online and offline, constantly having to kind of prove who you are as a man or a boy, when on the inside you're probably completely different. And there was this big conflict of self within this group of young men that we spoke to. And I thought that really stood out to me. And I thought, wow, we're not even equipping them with or working with them to find the tools in how to negotiate that. It's something they have to manage themselves, because there's a fear of them speaking up in case they're told to just be quiet. You're privileged, be quiet, you don't have a voice in this. And they should, because I think it's one of the reasons how we're going to solve these problems.
Absolutely. I think whenever we're in a situation where one group has bad things happen to them, and that bad things happen because of another group, the only way that things can really change is if that other group becomes the advocate and the supporter and the best friend of the group that's having the bad time.
But I think
sense.
It does, but the advocacy works both ways, in terms of men and boys speaking up, male mental health. Like I said, there's this intersection that I think we quite often forget. And then, I think because of the kind of recent rhetoric around genders, it's being pushed back into the binary, and it's as if people are being asked to pick a side. You're either with us or you're not. And then where does that leave our trans and non-binary folk? They're firmly in the crosshairs at the moment, and we have to do all we can to protect these young people, because it's going to be a rough few years, I think.
Yeah. People may have listened to you and thought, I see myself doing this work. I see myself working with young people. I would love to make a difference in the world of sexual health and in the well-being of our young folk. Where would you direct them if that's their thinking?
So for me, I started in the charity sector, so the third sector. So have a look at what charities are doing for young people in your area. I think that the game's shifted a little bit now, because a lot of youth work stopped. But I think it feels like there's a lot more going on in that space. So if you're interested in working with young parents, or if you're interested in working in sexual health or with young men and boys, have a look what's going on in your local area, contact the council and see which initiatives are being laid out, because there will be something. And I would say, that's the way I would get into it. Have a look at youth groups. You can do so much in a youth club, so much. You can talk about mental health, you can talk about sexual health, you can talk about poignant issues, you can talk about current issues, you can talk about schools, so look at what youth groups are on in the area and try and see how you can work with them. But you have to understand that it can't be tokenistic, it's real. If you're working with young people, it has to come from a good place, not from a place where you like to tell people you work with young people. You really have to care. And that's how I would start, and that's how I started. And then if you're interested in the academic side, I started studying, I started researching, just as an undergraduate degree. Then I did a master's, then I did my PhD. But I did all that when quite late on. I didn't start in higher education till I was 26. So it shows you can do it. But yeah, so that's the way I would go into it. And like I said, I mean, start to look at where the government initiatives are at the moment. So the current government are trying to reduce violence against women and well, it's women and girls, but it should be women and children by 50% in the next 10 years. So there's going to be money to work with young men and boys. So it's looking at these kind of government initiatives and think, right, that means there's money attached to this. That means there might be projects going on that I can join and volunteer with or go and work a few hours a week. But any kind of work with youth is really valuable.
And on the flip side, let's say you're a parent of somebody who is a teenager and you think, oh, they might love to be involved in that kind of thing. There's kind of the two sides. There's the adult and then there's the young person. How might a young person get involved?
I think the same route, really. You know, if they join local youth groups, youth advocacy groups, school councils, and start looking, you know, at sexual health charities for young people and contacting them as a young person, because there's quite a lot that have young people steering groups. They have young people carry out the interviews. The one that I worked at, they interviewed the chief exec, and one of the interviewers was a young person. So there's a lot of roles for young people in this that will spearhead their voices. So have a look again, you know, what's going on at school in the local area, but also in the charity sector. And if there's any kind of steering groups, or advisory groups that charities want in terms of this. And I think that we'll probably find something because it's such a valuable element to this kind of work.
Yeah, and I think maybe through helping others, they can help themselves as well. We can all help ourselves
Yeah.
improve our, well-being through those avenues. Thank you so much, Sophie. You've given us so much food for thought, really inspirational. Thank you. And this is a podcast where I really would recommend that you look at the show notes as well. Sophie's written some really fascinating articles and research papers, and there's lots of content in the show notes that you could well find useful if you've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time today, Sophie.
Well, thanks for having me.